Principles of Heritage Asset Management. So this is part of our policy for government management of cultural heritage places. So thank you again for all being here. You should all have everything shared in terms of the agenda. So just quickly, first is my introduction, of course, but then we're going to hand it over to Dr. Christine Waibrew, who will talk about introduction to the principles of heritage asset management, and also then Pouhere Taonga's role within that. And then to Vanessa Tanner, who's our Manager Archaeology here at Heritage New Zealand. That'll be about archaeological site management. Then Bruce Keenan from MB will talk to you about Government Property Group's role in property management planning. Then we'll have Sam Thompson and Simon Cruikshank from Ministry of Education talking about heritage asset management case studies. So that'll be interesting to see some examples of that. And then about 4:45, we'll open it up for some of your questions, which will be really good to hear, and then some final thoughts and closing. So thank you again for all being online, and I'll hand it over to Christine. Kia ora, Christine.
Kia ora, Dean. Tēnā koutou, ngā mihi e kia koutou, ke Pouhere Taonga au e mahi ana, he kaiwhakahaere mātua tōku tūna mahi, ko Christine Waibrew tōku ingoa. My name is Christine Waibrew. I'm Director Southern for Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga, coming to you live from sunny Ōtautahi. I have the sun on my back, and it's very good to be here. So as Dean introduced, I will be giving you a bit of a very brief run through to the introduction to the principles of heritage asset management, and I'll touch on our role as an advisor and regulator in asset management. And I'll then hand over to my colleague Vanessa, who will talk a little bit more about our role in relation to archaeology. So first of all, a bit of a recap. In November 2022, Cabinet agreed to adopt the revised policy for government departments' management of historic heritage. The policy came into effect on the 1st of February this year, and at that time Manatū Taonga also published guidance on their website, and that's the guidance document that you see there on the left. It's on my left, I assume it's also on your left. The guidance, I actually have to say the guidance goes into a little more depth than the policy, and it's actually quite a good way to get familiar with this policy. The guidance emphasises the need to integrate heritage asset management into all stages of the property management cycle. So for those of you that attended the previous webinar, you'll remember that webinar looked at heritage identification and assessment. That's that understand part of this cycle on the right, and also touched on the disposal process in relation to Crown property, and by association the acquisition and lease process as well. So this webinar today, we're going to be looking at the planning and management side of the cycle, and that's what I'm going to touch on today. So by planning, I'll just read out what it says here: plan strategically for all cultural heritage, prepare conservation plans for places, plan for maintenance and manage, formally protect values, promote cultural heritage, use appropriately, monitor condition, and upgrade where necessary. I will say quite plainly that heritage assets aren't like normal property assets, and sometimes those normal assumptions that we apply to life cycle maintenance don't apply. Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga is itself a manager of Crown-owned heritage assets. We have a portfolio of 45 properties throughout Aotearoa, New Zealand. Most of which are adaptively reused. We have mission stations, mansions, a blockhouse, a mill, engineering works, a whaling station. None of these are operating for their original use. Generally, they're operated as visitor attractions. But we do have one exception. Next slide, please, Angelica. Our one exception is Ophir Post Office, which is New Zealand's oldest operating standalone post office, situated in Ophir, Central Otago. While we do open it for visitors, it does function on a daily basis as a post office. I find this quite a useful case study because it is so cute and petite, but it does pose some interesting issues for us. It has the full suite of heritage protection measures, or a very full suite of heritage protection measures, which you'll see here on the right. It's a Category 1 historic place, but it's also situated within a historic area, both on that's on the New Zealand Heritage List Rārangi Kōrero. It's also situated on not one but 2 historic reserves, which are in themselves a heritage protection mechanism, and it is a scheduled heritage item in the Central Otago District Plan. So recap, heritage protection actually comes through scheduling in the District Plan. It is an archaeological site. It's a recorded archaeological site, but helpfully it bears its own date, 1886. It is a pre-1900 building, and by the definition under our Act, it is protected as a historical site, as an archaeological site. So we care for this asset and all our assets through an asset management system, which is a generic system which hasn't been specifically developed for heritage, but the same principles do apply for managing heritage buildings as with any other building. You need to keep the weather out, you need to keep the pests out, you need to keep a building secure, and you need to manage the risks that are posed to the building and the place. And so our asset management system gives us a component level survey down to individual elements within each building and a lifespan suggested for each. So if we look at this example, this drone photo is very nicely showing us the roof. Our asset management system tells me that this roof is in moderate condition, but it has a 25-year life and it's due for replacement in 2024. That's next year. We're going to replace that roof next year with long run iron? I don't think so. But this does indicate to us, having this flagged in our asset management system, does indicate to us that the roof is due for some attention to extend the life of this component. So my message to you is that it is important to integrate heritage assets into your asset management systems. They're great for baseline surveys and they're excellent for tracking condition. But guidance on the policies, priorities and best practice for heritage asset management come from somewhere else. They come from conservation plans and they come from advice from heritage professionals. So there are a number of heritage professionals working as consultants out there in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also we do have some colleagues working in Australia who work on our sites as well. But in the first instance, Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga can provide some specialist advice. At our offices throughout Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have conservation advisors, archaeologists, planners, historians, Māori heritage advisors, and also outreach advisors if there's an opportunity to collaborate perhaps on heritage engagement at some of the properties you might manage. And so that, in a nutshell, is the conclusion to my little bit of the presentation. And I'll hand over now to Vanessa, who will talk some more about the advice that we can provide in relation to archaeological site management. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Christine. Kia ora, Vanessa. We're just checking in that you're online.
Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora.
Kia ora, Dean. Ko Vanessa Tanner tōku ingoa. I am the Manager of Archaeology at Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga, and I am going to give you a brief introduction to archaeological site management. If I could have the first slide up. Thank you. So I've just put up the Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga Act's definition of an archaeological site. An archaeological site is evidence of human activity where that occurred prior to 1900. It can be a place, a building, structure, the wreck of a ship, that can, through the use of archaeological methods, provide evidence relating to the history of New Zealand. Archaeological sites have cultural value to kaitiaki Māori as the sites provide tangible evidence of ngā tūpuna. While the majority of archaeological sites in New Zealand relate to Māori occupation and now comprise things like earthworks and subsurface layers in the soil, other items that might not be immediately come to mind, such as villas built prior to 1900, are also considered archaeological sites for the purpose of our Act if they are proposed for demolition. In addition, Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga may declare a post-1900 archaeological site, and then the archaeological provisions of the Act then apply to those as well. Can I have the next slide, please? So policy 7 says that government agencies will research and identify heritage places on the property they manage. The accompanying guidance document recognises that there are likely to be unidentified places of cultural heritage value in government property portfolios. And this, I think, is particularly true for archaeological sites, and particularly if the property has not been systematically surveyed for archaeological sites. It is recommended that archaeological advice, survey and assessment of each property is therefore undertaken. Policy 8 is around the preparation and maintenance of an inventory. And this was introduced to you in the webinar, the previous webinar. But in terms of archaeological sites, the New Zealand Archaeological Association's ARC site is the national inventory of archaeological sites for New Zealand, and is the first point for information on archaeological sites present on a property. Absence of information, however, is not necessarily representative of absence of sites, and may be the result of lack of systematic archaeological survey and assessment. My advice in creating your inventory is to visit ArcSite in the first instance. If there are archaeological sites recorded there, and to engage an archaeologist to assist on spatially defining them for you. And if there are no archaeological sites there, ask why. It's entirely possible that is because the property has not been systematically surveyed by an archaeologist. An inventory of archaeological sites is best managed in a geographical information system that includes the spatial extent of archaeological sites so that they can be planned for and managed. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So in terms of the principles in the policy, Principle 7 government agencies are responsible for the long-term stewardship of public assets, including cultural heritage, and the principle that government agencies will lead by example by adopting appropriate heritage management strategies, processes and practices. The New Zealand government shows leadership by setting the standard for management of cultural heritage assets and values to the rest of the community. Policy 10 says that government agencies will provide for the long-term conservation of cultural heritage in their care. So in terms of archaeological sites, your objective is therefore to preserve the archaeological sites on your properties in situ. The best way to do this is to avoid activity that may modify or destroy those archaeological values. Often they are in-ground, so designing any in-ground works to avoid archaeological deposits. Hence why that GIS-based inventory is recommended as a tool for managing and therefore planning for the protection of those in-situ deposits. This also aligns with the Policy 13. When planning and carrying out work adjacent to heritage places, government agencies will seek to ensure that heritage values are not adversely affected. Policy 12 is around using, adopting and protecting cultural heritage places. You'll see an example on the slide here as an innovative way to utilise an archaeological site. This is Christchurch Boys High School, where they have preserved a subfloor layer inside a former blacksmith forge and stables, which has been transformed into a boardroom, museum, archive room and archivist's office. As archaeological mitigation can be costly, avoiding impacting archaeological sites may also be the most cost-effective option. However, where avoidance is not possible, government agencies will mitigate to the greatest extent possible the adverse effects. And in terms of archaeological sites, this might constitute preservation by record. And that's a topic that I'm going to talk to you about in the next webinar around applying for archaeological authorities administered under our Act. Thank you.
Kia ora, Vanessa, thank you for that. And really important, again, about seeking the right advice, in this case from Pouhere Taonga, Heritage New Zealand, but also from consultants in terms of archaeologists as well to help with inventories and assessments. So kia ora mō tēnā. So now we're going to turn to Bruce from MB to talk us through Government Property Group's role in property management planning. Kia ora, Bruce. Just check Bruce is able to come on. Ka pai.
Yeah, kia ora. Thank you. Yeah, I'm Bruce Kenning. I'm the manager of the planning and advisory team within the Government Property Group. So the Government Property Group is a small business unit hosted within the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. So our chief executive is one of a number of what they call system leaders, and she is also the system lead for procurement. Next slide. Thanks. So what do we mean by property system leadership? So it's about taking a whole of government future-focused portfolio approach for our office accommodation. So our remit is 73 government agencies, office accommodation, whether it's owned or leased, and it includes public interface. So we also coordinate the leadership of best property practice for office accommodation across those mandated Crown agencies. Those 73 departments and agencies occupy approximately 1 million square metres of office space. 95% of that is actually leased. So our strategic drivers are to support the transformation of the public service as set out in the 2020 Public Service Act, to support agencies with their obligations under the Carbon Neutral Government Program. So many of you will be aware of that program. We report to CNGP ministers regularly within the Government Property Group. It's on the results of NABERS NZ, which is the energy rating system used to report on the energy efficiency of office buildings. And at the same time, our procurement colleagues also report on the transition of vehicle fleets to electric vehicles. So government workplaces are a key enabler to changing the way the public service operates. So the public sector broadly is adapting to global megatrends, including new technologies, activity-based working, flexible working arrangements, a stronger focus on wellbeing, reducing the government's carbon footprint, and keeping staff and agencies safe. So what do we do within GPG? Well, we deliver a number of standards and guidelines, and we also link on our website. So our website is obviously aimed at those 73 departments and agencies, but it is an open website and anyone can access that. We also link on our website to other guidance, such as that provided by Ministry of Cultural and Heritage. So you can go to the GPG website, which will explain what the policy is, and then take you through to the detail on other websites. In a similar manner, we also provide links to New Zealand Police, who host the Crowded Places strategy, which is about how we keep crowded places, which can be, including office accommodation, safe. Over the last few years, we've been involved in delivering a number of projects. Larger examples would be in Christchurch. There's what's known as SIGA, so the Christchurch Integrated Government Accommodation, 4 anchor projects built after the Kaikoura earthquakes that included the Emergency Services Complex. And we are currently managing the refit of Bowen House in the Wellington CBD. So that will become a hub for a number of agencies. Next slide, thanks. So as we all appreciate, the global pandemic has really changed the way that we socialise and work. And we can see government hubs as having wider benefits for public sector workers. So that would include allowing people to reduce their commute times, and it also supports agencies to lower their carbon emissions. It improves the health and well-being by giving people a choice of where to work, so that can lower stress and lead to improved productivity. And we can add resilience across the portfolio for anticipated and not so anticipated events, such as the recent pandemic. Initially, that focus will be on the back office functions, but it will then grow to incorporate customer-facing activities where this is sensible. So a good recent example of this is MB itself, which has recently taken space at the Blue Mountains campus in Upper Hutt. That site will accommodate, I think, just over 100 people, but it's not been designed for teams. It's been designed to allow people flexibility. We have 4 expectations that government has placed for government property, and they came into effect in a 2018 cabinet paper. You can see those on the bottom of that slide there. So the 4 expectations are around community focus. So that's agencies being connected to the people they deliver service for, especially in the region. So over the next few years, we expect to see less public servants in the metros, Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch, and more people out in the regions being closer to the people that they deliver services for. Collaboration. We want agencies to collocate and collaborate together. Valuing people. We need to provide better quality buildings demonstrating that we value our people and then therefore enabling them to do their jobs better. And public value, providing value for money for the taxpayer. So you're never going to get away from that one. Next slide, thanks. We talked earlier about managing the information that's required to support these heritage assets, and we have a database called Archivus. It's a world-renowned system, scores very well in the Gartner reports, and it's actually more recently become part of a wider ecosystem of software products called Eptura. That system is funded by those 73 agencies who pay an annual subscription based on the amount of space that they occupy. So for those 73 agencies, if they were using Archivus to manage their heritage assets, there's actually there would be no additional cost for them. The main modules that we currently use in that system now are lease management. That's the one we use the most, but there are also modules for asset management, facilities management, and workspace. And we are investigating other modules to help with particularly the carbon neutral government program and other things like that. This database, so as I said, that database may be able to be used for managing those heritage assets. Okay, next slide, thanks. So property planning. So GPG undertakes property port planning to understand and identify opportunities to better manage the Crown Office portfolio, reasonably significant, as I've already mentioned. We analyse the data in that portal and apply market and agency intelligence to provide a regional plan for each of the 16 regions. And then separately, we also produce plans for, as I mentioned, the 3 metros, Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch. So that planning process helps inform what we call the Government Office Accommodation Program. So that's a requirement of that 2018 Cabinet paper, which updated our mandate. So we identify opportunities in the region, focusing on towns and cities where several agencies may be located, and look to create value through co-location opportunities. So value can be created by having multiple agencies coming together to lease space, sharing common areas and amenities such as end-of-trip facilities, meeting rooms, kitchens and reception areas. And then the larger these co-located sites are, it allows us to maximise the utilisation of sites. We know at the moment that a number of sites across the country are very underutilised as a result of people taking up working from home opportunities. And as part of that planning, we also aim to remove any competitive tension between agencies, as historically we have actually competed against ourselves, particularly in the Wellington CBD when the demand for office accommodation has been high and agencies have been tight for space. Next slide, thanks. Right, so the next two slides are an example of one of our regional plans. So in this case, Otago. So this is a high-level summary of that. So at the top of the slide, we can see that we've got 20 government agencies who operate in the Otago region. Otago region itself, 6 towns and cities, and those 20 government agencies have 26 office locations in that space and occupy nearly 34,000 square metres of space. Now, the majority of that is actually in Dunedin. And we know from market intelligence that there are very few energy efficient and resilient office building in Dunedin, apart from the ACC new build, which is currently under development. There has been very little new development in Dunedin over the last 10 or 15 years. So what is this regional summary suggesting? So based primarily on agency lease renewals and expiries, there's potentially an opportunity for up to 11 agencies to work better in a government hub. What we need to do is select agencies with similar working styles and security settings who could possibly benefit from new ways of working. Potentially, this could reduce the number of sites in that city by up to 5. It's important to note that this isn't about shoehorning public servants into less office space. It's about making sure that we're using the efficient use of space going forward. The savings in space represent the fact that currently each of these small sites will have a reception area, lunch area, meeting rooms, and other shared spaces that could be better utilised if they were shared with others. We've already made great efficiencies in the government office space over the last few years. Currently, occupancy across the country is about 15 square metres per person, but flexible ways of working is being widely adopted, and we know that this could allow us to push this even further. Next slide, thanks. Yep. So yeah, that's just highlighting the opportunity that exists. So I guess just to summarise, so the GPG remit, I don't really like using the word mandate there, is the Crown Office portfolio, 95% of which is leased. Those standards and guidelines can be used by all agencies across their portfolio. They can also be used by any other government department or agency. Archibus may have utility as a Crown database and may be able to be used to report on heritage assets. We already have a couple of local authorities who are using our system to manage their assets. And asset management is going to become much more important under system leadership as accountability moves to a more centralised model. So system leadership is very recent, was only really announced and pushed, I guess, in the last 12 months. Thanks for that.
Kapai, thank you, Bruce. Great to get that overview of the government property group's work and role, and also Archibus, how that works, how that can be utilised. So, ngā mihi, Bruce, kia ora. So now we're going to switch to some heritage asset management case studies. So we've got Sam, I believe, first up to take us through that. Are you there, Sam?
I sure am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, there you are. Great. Thanks, Sam. Ngā mihi, over to you. Kia ora.
Kia ora tātou. Ko Sam Thompson, tōku ingoa, e kai whakahaere tohu hangarau au I te tāhuhu o te mātauranga. My name is Sam Thompson. I manage the technical advisory team at the Ministry of Education. It's a recently established function where we're building, I guess, a core of technical advisory functions covering building compliance, construction quality assurance, water and electrical services, asset data, asbestos management, and other, a central view on other portfolio-wide issues like heritage management. We have 2,089 state schools in the portfolio. Bit of context before we get into the case studies. The Tomorrow's Schools Review in 1989 effectively devolved all power and responsibility for management of schools, including the site and the property investment to schools. Certainly over the last 10 years, it's become apparent that that wasn't a success in terms of good asset management practice. So we're on a trajectory to provide more central strategy and support across that, which is a work in progress. given how expensive that is. But if I could just have the first slide up, please. So yeah, we historically have had schools managing their own property. We were a funding organisation. We set some broad guidelines for how schools manage their property. A small number of schools did it really well. A large number haven't done it really well, and that's resulted in quite a large infrastructure deficit in our schools. And that's also impacted our heritage, the good management of our heritage portfolio. Unlike a lot of other agencies whose heritage buildings are either repurposed or not currently in use, as their heritage features make them, I guess, no longer fit for purpose, almost all of our heritage buildings in particular are in ongoing education use. They're very core to schools' sense of identity and place in their community. And as a result, they have been invested in by schools. That said, schools, I am not sure, school boards are, I'm sure, not fully aware of their obligations either under the previous policy or the new policy. So that's a piece of work where, another piece of work where we're trying to provide more advice and support. Part of that for us in that transition from devolution to a more mixed model where we provide extra support is trying to better understand our assets, and that's not just our heritage assets, all of our assets. We're still on a journey there. The good thing is we do know enough about our heritage assets to know that they're not out of step with the condition of the wider portfolio, and that is because they're in use. And they're used as teaching spaces or administration spaces. The biggest challenge that the ministry has in keeping those buildings in use is their performance as a teaching space. I guess they're traditionally smaller single cell buildings. They don't really allow teachers to teach in the way that they currently want to. Addressing issues like acoustics and so on is a little bit harder in a heritage building, and so any investment does cost significantly more, and is, I guess, perhaps a disincentive to some schools to really apply the level of interest in those buildings. So the ministry is doing a piece of work to review our previous policy and make sure that when schools are investing in their properties, that the appropriate approaches are being taken, which Simon will talk to shortly. The other challenge that we have in doing so is that balance which all of the other agencies that I've been talking to are facing, which is the I guess the increased compliance-driven legislation that we're facing, and a more constrained financial situation, which is likely to roll on for quite some time to come. But that's the context in which we work. And Simon can tell you a little bit more about a couple of schools in the South Island that where we've taken two different approaches to heritage management. I guess one's probably an example of what we could do better and learn from, an experience we could learn from. And one is an example where we've proactively stepped in to help a school that was unable to meet the quite complex heritage management needs of a particular building. So I'll hand over to Simon.
Good point. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Sam. Kia ora, Simon. I'm the Regional Infrastructure Manager for the South Island for the Ministry of Ed, which effectively means all the property in the South Island is my fault. I guess, as Sam mentioned there, for a long time, schools have been basically ministry has been a funding stream for schools who've been managing their own property. The requirements of that are set out in what we call the property occupancy document, the POD, and that literally detailed what schools' responsibility around their property was. However, obviously with the funding that schools are given, if the property is maintained at a certain level, it's deemed adequate really to keep it going. But as soon as things start to deteriorate, the funding perhaps isn't enough to bring them back to a level. The first one we're going to talk about here, Arthur Street, is probably a really good example of exactly that scenario, where a lightweight timber frame building, picture of it there on the screen. Quite a tall building, only single story with a small mezzanine inside. Once it became surplus to the school's actual entitlement, funding was directed elsewhere. Over the years, a lean-to had effectively been tagged onto the right-hand side of that photograph as you look at it. Toilet block tagged on the front side of it, as you can see on the left there. Neither of which particularly well done, which caused significant water ingress into the building. So I guess to use, I think, a term Christine used right at the start, keeping weather out and pests out. Not really what was happening in this scenario. We worked with the school, and actually this particular building was a reason why the schools ended up in a significant redevelopment. It was all triggered by the condition of this building. One of the things that probably we didn't do particularly well in this scenario was look at how we could incorporate this building into that redevelopment. We probably underestimated the public interest as well that would be generated by this building. It was actually in the media quite a bit in Dunedin, with very polarizing opinions from the community as well. We looked at a number of options discussed with the community in the end. One of them was, relocating the building to a heritage site in Christchurch, which I don't think was anybody's preferred option in the end. Relocating it to an adjacent council park, which was literally right next to the school. Council not particularly interested in that, effectively taking on the liability. There was a couple of options put forward about early childhood or museum, but obviously being on a primary school site, neither of the, well, certainly the museum option wasn't really considered appropriate. Where we've ended up with is we're going to convert the building into a technology centre, which will service the school, which is probably the one function that their new development wasn't going to cover. So I guess one of the key bits around this that we are taking learnings from is understanding what our requirements are as a government agency around our heritage buildings. It was probably the first one really I became involved with, and whilst we thought we were probably doing the right thing with who we're engaging with, probably weren't in the end. So certainly understanding more around what our requirements are with heritage will certainly would have made this a much smoother process, I think. Do you want to flick on to the next one for me? So this is Waitaki Boys High School. Actually, some of the more perceptive of you might have noticed that I'm not a Kiwi lad. I actually come from the northeast of England, from Durham. And while Durham might not have a lot of Oamaru stone buildings, it certainly has an awful lot of buildings which look very similar to this. So this has always been kind of a building quite close to my heart. It was actually a board-owned building, but a very similar scenario in that weather was having a significant negative impact on the building. There was pests getting into the building as well. The cost of remediation is running into the millions. There's also obviously because of the type of building it is, there's a bit of a dearth in the skills, and there's that's only getting less of the people with the capability to do some of the work that's required on this kind of building. The school also has significant problems as a board raising funds. I think there's a perception with charities and other funding organisations that because it's on a school site, the ministry will fund. But as a board building, we generally wouldn't. We've ended up, I guess, stepping in, and we've done with the school, with the board, done an awful lot of consultation with their community, especially the old boys, around the ownership of this building. And the ministry is actually stepped in and taken ownership of the building so that we can actually start and spend some money ourselves on it. Some of the internal fittings, such as the organ, the board were very keen to maintain ownership of. I think that was seen by the old boys to be something which was really close to their hearts. Interestingly enough, one of the real positives we've had in us taking it as well is we've been able to source some of the same tiles for the roof from Christchurch boys, which actually reusing some of those, shipping them down to put onto here, which will solve hopefully all the problems. So yeah, first thing we've really done here is managed to stop the water getting in, which hopefully will stop some deterioration while we work through the rest. There is significant cost in scaffolding going to be required here, but I think it's probably an example of how our understanding of the expectations on heritage building owners and understanding the community has developed from the Arthur Street scenario. And that's us.
Great, thanks, Simon. Simon and Sam, that was great to have a look at those examples, and the Waitaki Boys High School one was really interesting to see. Obviously a complex project, but you know, immensely important to that community as well. So ngā mihi for that. So now we got to the bit, now just before that, we are actually recording this, so it's available for others or for you to have a look at later on. So that should come out, a link for that will be sent out by Tuesday the 7th of November, so keep an eye out for that. But now's the time to ask questions of our presenters. So we might go to full screen, we might stop sharing so we can see everyone. We'll do that. Now, so there's a Q&A section on the webinar there. And so we'll just bring that up and see what questions you've got for us. So we've got about 10 minutes for this. So it'd be great to hear some of your questions so we can, so any questions there so far? Not so far, I'm sure there is.
I don't have a question, Dean, but if you like, I have a comment that I would like to make in support of Simon's presentation. Thank you, Simon, for that great work that you have done at the Waitaki Boys High Hall of Memories. It is a very special place, and yeah, I've been working with the school Board of Trustees, and they've got a committee that's dedicated to looking after the Hall of Memories. And yes, fundraising was a challenge for them, but one of the biggest challenges that they had was even when they were able to get the funds, the project management was quite difficult for them. As a board of volunteers, they don't necessarily have those skills all the time among their number to be able to project manage what is actually a very complex project in terms of the watertightness, in terms of the heritage skills that are needed, but it's a massive structural engineering project in itself. So yeah, that they certainly breathed a massive sigh of relief when your offer came in. So I just wanted to mihi to you for that, but yeah, also raise that other benefit. It's not all about money, but it kind of is. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thanks,
Actually,
Kristen.
I'll just that building used to house some amazing history, flags from ships from the war, just some amazing things, which thankfully the school have removed from them over the last few years, and I think some are in the museum in Oamaru, and some are in storage. And one of the key things they want to do is to get those things back into the building. It really is quite phenomenal, some of the things they had in there, and I would recommend if anyone ever has a chance, probably give it a year or two, but to go and have a look at the building and what's in there when they get them back.
And they still use it as their assembly hall, or actually probably not right now because you're busy strengthening it, but yeah, until recently at least, it's in daily use.
Ka pai. Yeah, just checking in. Don't think we've got any questions so far. Oh, I must have given you. Oh, hang on. Here we go. Right. So we've got a question here. I'm attending this hui on behalf of Land Eater Limited, who manage the use of Te Taumatua Oh, the longest place name. I'm wondering whether Te Taumata sits amongst this kaupapa, please. So I know a little bit about this. This is down in Wairarapa. Yes, that's down in Wairarapa. So that is actually that's listed with Pouhere Taonga as I think it's a Wāhi Tapu site. So it's, in that sense, it has recognition around the kōrero that relates to Te Taumata, which is really it's a mihi to one of the famous tipuna captains on who basically surveyed the coastline in that area on the Takitimu Waka, ended up in the South Island. So it's important in terms of the context of the early kōrero of that area, but also nationally as a story as well about arrival of waka. So yeah, from what I understand, my understanding is that it actually has that recognition in terms of Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga list. That's probably, but in terms of protections and other things that might sit around that would sit within the district plan rules. So I hope that helps a wee bit, but of course, come and talk to Pouhere Taonga if you have any other questions related to that out of hours as well. Anything else there from the people who have joined us? Well, if there aren't any more, I'd just like to, oh, here we go. No, here we go. People are warming up now. Kia ora koutou. What would be your advice for digital preservation enthusiasts of heritage buildings in places with aerial mapping and laser scanning, and some cases converting into BIM models to use those models as potential fundraising platforms for projects similar to Waitaki Boys? So I guess it's this, yeah, all of the kind of digital tools that are available now. And we also get some comments, I guess, from our presenters also on BIM models, because that's quite a detailed kind of end of managing a place, and when you get down to the specific components and how they actually fit together in a 3D environment. That's my understanding. But yeah, does anyone want to have a comment about sort of digital tools in terms of these things and fundraising in particular?
I just probably not answer the question directly, but I might just part of the conversation at the start was certainly from the education portfolio was around how we're really coming from a long way back in terms of understanding everything that we have. We are starting to do some small instances of 3D scanning of our school buildings, which allows us to do a lot more work from a desktop basis, but that's large. I think it's around 200 schools to date. There is no more money for that. It would be awesome for us to be able to get that rolled out around the country. My team are working on a small project to, I guess, to also create a geospatial tool, which again we do not have as an asset manager, so we're a long way behind. But one of the things that is high on our list to map is our heritage sites. So we've got a few irons in the fire. There's lots and lots of potential in all of that technology. I would say we're probably 10 years away before that stuff is part of our suite of tools, because we've got such a big deficit. But certainly the opportunities for using those tools in our heritage management quite significant.
Great, thank you, Sam. And of course, we also mentioned about GIS systems, those other spatial systems particularly for things like archaeological sites, but all heritage sort of asset areas, because often some of these places aren't obvious, on first look. They may actually be below the landscape, if you like, or embedded into the landscape. So it's often important to have these tools that give you that overview of places as well.
And just to tautoko what Sam said, yes, there is a use for 3D scanning and BIMs in heritage asset management. It's particularly helpful if you are managing a site that is remote, or at least not where you are. So yeah, I've seen it used quite effectively at one property in our portfolio, Hokitika Government Building, which has been really helpful for getting people around the table and looking at an issue in the 3D scan without having to physically be there. So yeah, there is a role for it, but yes, we are cost constrained in that, as I believe most people are.
And thank you, Christine. And I think the other thing also is about how digital tools can actually help in interpretation and realising value of place. And that's a really important part, particularly when you're creating a sense of identity for communities. And that's where it was really interesting listening to the examples of schools, because really you have a direct identity of community to place, and particularly when that place is still running as it was originally intended. The exception otherwise is being like the Ophir Post Office, which is a really lovely example of continuing something in a functional sense, but also really highlighting a legacy, which, you know, in many respects is of national importance, because where else do we point to some of the early beginnings of our postal system? It's really the Ophir Post Office, yeah. I'm just checking if there are any other pātai that have come through. It looks like we might be at the end of that, I think. So just some quick sort of overview comments on our session today. And again, thank you again to all of our presenters for doing that. It was really great to listen to Christine's just sort of overview of the process around heritage asset management, but importantly, how you often need, whilst, you know, generic systems are good for that day-to-day and even sort of that sort of long-term planning, really what also needs to be in there is that more specific detail or frameworks, particularly through conservation plans and other technical advice you get from conservation professionals. So that's really important as part of that broader heritage asset management. Thank you, Vanessa. Really to highlight the whole importance around the archaeological context and archaeological resource or assets as well. So importantly, it's also about getting that technical advice from archaeologists and often also that relationship you may have with mana whenua as well, in terms of giving the proper context in terms of that kōrero tuku iho that relates to site. Just as that question asked about te taumata over in the Wairarapa. So kia ora, Vanessa, for that. And Bruce, thank you. It was really interesting to hear about the group property, you know, how that whole portfolio areas works and that management across departments. And I think the real possibilities around kind of utilising heritage places in that context there's a lot of potential there, because some of these places have often a lot of space and there's flexibility a lot of the time in terms of adaptive reuse of heritage places. So interested to hear how that can coalesce together and make something a possibility. So ngā mihi for that, Bruce. And really just coming back again to the examples you're able to provide us, Sam and Simon, thank you for that. And I think just reiterating in that particular context for schools, where it's such a strong community identity that often is related to schools. And for many, as you know, parents, and when your children are growing up, it's often the way into a community. So when you sort of marry up heritage places, the legacy of schools and community, you have quite a powerful thing that really adds to a sense of well-being for people in our communities. So thank you for the examples and doing that. Oh, and I've got one question here. Thank you. Here it is. Acknowledging the uniqueness of these heritage assets, does the ministry intend to have a fairly broad idea of unit rates to mitigate some, oh, it just popped off, some buildings, I think it said. Sorry, did someone grab that? A response to that? I can't see the question anymore. It's disappeared. So, sorry, that one's evaporated, I think. No one can respond to that? No, it's all right. Okay, well, I think we're, oh, here we go. Sorry, I've got it on another device. Unit rates, sorry, I'll just read this again. Acknowledging the uniqueness of these heritage assets, does the ministry intend to have a fairly broad idea of unit rates to mitigate some buildings? So I'm not too sure. Does anyone want to respond to that? I don't have any.
Well, if reference to, I guess, Ministry of Education buildings.
Education, possibly, yeah.
Yeah, our funding is obviously policy based, and it's basically based on a square meterage rate of entitlement. We have discussed internally around whether we should be looking at something which changes with heritage buildings. But I think if you look at the two examples we had up there, very, very different structures with very different needs. So it's not as easy as just having I guess a different rate for a building, and also change our policy like that. There's big financial implications to it as well. So it's not the easiest thing.
But certainly we do have the funding is based on a formula to an extent, but where there's a demonstrated need to address something urgent, there's a fairly large capital budget that's prioritized to needs. So the cost will be what the cost will be to I guess bring those buildings back into a usable and protected state. So there aren't too many, but you do have that big dichotomy between a Wamaru stone building and a small lightweight timber structure, and ultimately we'll spend what needs to be spent to protect the buildings.
Kia ora. Thank you for that response. Well, I think we've reached the end of our session, and thank you again for that. Now, just to highlight what's coming up, just to let you know that, so today was the second session that we had on principles of heritage asset management. Now, our third in this series of webinars is actually coming up on Tuesday, the 5th of December. This is around managing change. So that again will be from 3:30 to 4:30 p.m. But a message will be going out through your channels to put that in your diaries. So that's the next one that's coming up before Christmas. And like I said earlier, the webinar link will come out to you on Tuesday the 7th for what we've recorded today. And then, of course, in the new year, we've got understanding the legislative framework for protecting heritage and then conservation planning. And so that's in February and March. So that's what's coming up between now and March next year. But again, just to thank everyone for their presentations, for all your presence being here on the webinar, and ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. And I'll finish with our karakia. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru tapanui. Kia wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua I te ara takatū. Ko ia rā e rongo, whakairi ake ki runga kia tīna. Haumi e, hui e, taiki e. Kia ora tātou, ngā mihi.